I learned to get over it in my own way, but nonetheless, I was seriously compromised, and it wasn't really, my father's fault. But you see, he grew up in the war. He was born in the war, and he grew up in the war. So all his childhood, all he knew was the war, and it wasn't like the war was over, see someplace, and he read about it in the newspapers and it was on television. No, no, he grew up in the middle of the war. In other words, what I'm saying, when he was 4, he saw human entrails spread out all over the ground and in the tree branches, and he saw the death, the carnage, the destruction. From a little child on up, he lived that. Now, something like that sticks with you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, okay, how much help you get. It doesn't matter. You can say you've put that behind you, but that has actually been internalized. And he grew up that way. And he developed a mindset of survivalism and a very desperate sort of mindset. And it affected him. And we have to understand that if your parents were children who grew up in the war, you have to understand that you were greatly impacted by your parents, because no parent will ever raise their children the same way as a parent who never grew up in the war. Okay, it's not the same, right? They are permanently changed. Their mind is permanently changed. Their knowledge is completely different than somebody who only saw images on a television and read about it in the newspaper, that sort of thing. No, no, they lived the war. They lived through the war. They were impacted by the war, and they internalized the war. The war is in them. And so when you are being raised by parents who actually lived in the middle of war, you will be consequently impacted by them, and you will not be quote unquote normal. Okay, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, because quote unquote normal is sometimes pretty lousy. But I want to really press upon this, because I don't think very many people are aware of how much war impacts people. Because although some would say, this war is over or that war is over, no, it's not over, because the generations that follow are still impacted by it. The devastation is only begun. Okay, because those parents will raise those children very differently with a war mentality. And you can see them. My father's father fought in the war, and I'm going to fight in the war too. And this is a mentality. This is a mentality. This is a mindset. This is when war becomes a family tradition. Okay, when war becomes a way of life. I think anyone knows that war really, for all intents and purposes, is about death. Well, some could argue that maybe death is a way of life. But the devastation that war can generate, or I don't think it even starts to properly readjust itself until maybe the 3rd or 4th generation. Now, I'm first Canadian generation born of a war baby father who grew up with the war, and the war was still sort of going on by the time he came to Canada, by the time that he escaped Poland, with Russia moving in on Poland. But all I can say is that man was devastated and greatly impacted in his thinking. And as a teenager, I was, pardon me, I was wondering what's wrong with this man. I could not understand this man. I couldn't understand his values. I couldn't understand why he thought the way he did. I could not understand why he was so militant. And there were a lot of other things about him that I just could not appreciate, because he came from a war mentality. And, maybe some of you could share some of your thoughts on that with me. But I'm glad now that my father and I get along very well. And but as a youth, I had real difficulty relating to this, and it did impact me, and my values were altered also as a result of his imprinting on me. And imprinting is real, and it does affect our children. And I just really want to make it clear how destructive war is. It isn't just, the loss of buildings, or the loss of money, or the loss of economy, or the loss of, artifacts, or books, or any of these things. It is the impact for a society to catch up after a war. There is no catching up. Okay, there is no catching up. You're set back at least 3 or 4 generations. You're set back, and then by the time the 4th generation reaches some sort of stability factor, it's too far gone. They're left in the dust. This is what we see happening in the Middle East. This is what we see, in all these places like Sarajevo and all these different war zones. Okay, there is no catching up. It's gone. It's lost. It's done. And for 4 generations, those children are going to be impacted by the fallout, the psychological fallout, and the devastation of war. And it's really important to understand how this effect just ripples through time and through each generation, and how it impacts our thinking and our mentality. Because I think this is something that's been grossly overlooked, and it really needs to be looked at. Seriously examined, because it's shaping society, it's impacting society. When a child cannot relate to its parents at all, because the parents are so traumatized by war, the parents are already traumatizing their own offspring. And in order for the child to actually gain any sort of independence or sanity, it has to reject its parents, because its parents are so traumatized that, either you embrace their insanity and come and join them, or you have to put them at bay and say, wait a minute, hold on, let's get real here. We're not living in the war anymore. But but you see, what happens is, when a child loses respect for its parents, then how does that child turn out? If the child loses respect for its parents because that child thinks its parents have, flipped, they've gone, over the edge. See, for me, I didn't understand what caused all this sort of thinking. I didn't understand what all this real sort of anal, retentive, super, ultra defensive, overly secure sort of behavior was all about. And it just really didn't register. It was because my father grew up as a child in the war and lost his mother when he was very young, and had to fend for himself and suck it up and be a man. And, I can honestly say I wouldn't trade places with him. But at the same time, his rearing, it impacted me, and made me somewhat neurotic. And, I just thank God that Jesus can heal this stuff. I guess that's my conclusion on the matter. But if anybody has any thoughts regarding this subject, please feel free to comment, send your own video on it, whatever have you. But there it is. God bless you.